Hi, Misha here, and I seem to have honestly accidentally covered quite a bit more in the U.S. Navy aircraft than I have the U.S. Army Air Corps, later U.S. Army Air Forces, and of course U.S. Air Force. So let's start to try to rectify that a bit by talking about the Curtis P-40, aka the Warhawk, aka the Tomahawk, aka the Kitty Hawk. This was U.S., and I'll probably just call it Air Force, just for simplicity's sake, frontline fighter immediately before and at the beginning of World War II. And it was also used heavily by the British and other Commonwealth nations, as well as by the Soviet Union, and of course China. And it went through several versions and variants, from the original P-40 through the B, the E, and the N. And in a lot of ways, it's an unremarkable and almost generic aircraft. But oddly enough, that was really its strength, at least in 1941 through 1943. So, I'm going to talk a bit about it. I probably won't have time to do anything like its complete history today, but, hit some highlights, talk a bit about it. I have 3 models, all are 1/72 scale diecast, as usual. This one here is from Corgi. This is a P-40B, as flown at Pearl Harbor. We have another Corgi here. This is a Tomahawk Mark II-A, as flown in North Africa, 1942. And then finally, we have a P-40N. This was the final major production version, dating around 1944, and primarily used in China. And this model is actually from Hobby Master. Most of Hobby Master's World War II planes end up in the 1/48 scale, but this one's in 1/72. And it's good because it seems like Corgi mostly focuses on the early variants, leaving Hobby Master open to kind of focus on later ones like the N. So with that, why don't we jump into it and just kind of talk a bit about this aircraft's, frankly, very interesting history. Well, this model here is of George Welch's plane, as flown at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. But let's back up a bit. This started off way back in the 1930s. Now, I've done a video in the past on the Boeing P-26 pea shooter. Well, after it, we had the Curtis P-36 Hawk, which was the U.S. Army Air Corps' premier fighter in the late 1930s. And it was a enclosed canopy, monowing metal, retracting landing gear plane. Little lightly armed, little lightly armored. Not the fastest in the world, but not bad for that time. But in the summer of 1937, some at Curtis had the idea to replace the radial engine that it was using with an inline Allison engine, which would be smaller and have less drag. And while it wouldn't really give a lot more power or anything, it would be more sturdy and dependable. At least that was the idea. So they pulled the 10th production model P-36, turned it into the XP-40, slapped in the Allison, and took it for a test spin on October 4th, 1938, and it was disappointingly slow. So they went to the NACA wind test tunnel and figured out some things to do to make it actually fly right. Changed the position of some things and changed the doors for the landing gear as they were closed, and they were able to bump its max speed up to about 365 miles per hour. She had a comfortable top speed, sustainable at about 350, and she could cruise comfortably for a long period of time at over 300 miles per hour. So quite acceptable. Also, the plane was kind of unique for its day because it had a fully retracting tail wheel. Most of them back then didn't. Now, France and the UK were flying the P-36, meaning when World War II kicked off, they put it up against newer German planes like the Bf-109, and eventually it would go up against even newer planes like the FW-190, the Focke-Wulf. It's a fun word to say. This led basically to the Army Air Corps issuing a specification for a new fighter. Now, oddly enough, really, they wanted a conservative design. They wanted an improvement over the P-36. The thing is, they wanted it yesterday. So, first and foremost, they needed it able to go into production quickly and did not have a bunch of teething problems during the testing. And frankly, if it was cheap, hey, well, that's great. And several designs were submitted, like, for example, the XP-38 and the XP-39. And Curtis, who really needed the contract, submitted 3 different design proposals, including the already tested XP-40. And after a bit of a comparison, the U.S. Army Air Corps would select it. Because frankly, it was a known quantity. The P-36 was not a bad plane. It just needed an improvement. The new engine gave it a little bit better speed. And I think most importantly, the projections showed that they could be in service a full year before anything else, which honestly proved to be a very good thing. So, they placed a large order of over 500. It was actually the largest single order for aircraft that the U.S. military had placed since World War I. And Curtis had got to work. The first production model, internally known as the Model 81, came off the assembly line in May of 1940. And they started delivering them to the Army Air Corps. And by the end of that summer, they had nearly 200 in inventory, so much so that they started shipping additional ones to the UK. Now, originally France was going to buy them, but they got overrun before it could happen. So those ended up going to the UK instead. So they got their first ones towards the end of 1940, and whereas the US called it the P-40 Warhawk, the British at the time called it the Tomahawk Mark I. The P-40A was basically just a one-off photo reconnaissance. The next major version, which came out very quickly, the one here, is the P-40B, known in the UK as the Tomahawk Mark II. And it tried to address some of the early issues. For example, the early version only had 2 50 caliber machine guns in the fuselage and 1 30 caliber on each wing, while with the P-40B they upped that to 2 30 caliber machine guns for a total of 4, plus the 50 cals in the body. In the US, these would be 30-06. In the UK, they would be 303. They also gave some armor protection to the pilot, like the headrest, and they gave some partial protection to the fuel system, but not full protection yet. Additionally, the P-40 could carry a bomb load. Originally they had a shackle under each wing. Later they would add a belly hardpoint for either a fuel tank or another bomb with the P-40C. And it could carry up to 2,000 pounds. Most commonly it would have 3 500-pound bombs. Interestingly, the Air Corps really didn't concern itself with high-altitude interceptor dogfighters. It really viewed airplanes at the time as low-fighting, close air support fighter bombers. And that really kind of informs what they ended up adopting here. Overall, she's about 32 feet long, with a wingspan a bit over 37 feet. Typically, the top speed of a production model was under 340 miles per hour. Maximum altitude, especially with later models, was 29,000 feet. However, above 15,000 feet, she really couldn't dogfight. The inline engine just was not a high altitude performer. Just kind of what it is. So, this was in service by 1941, and in service in quite respectable numbers considering just how new it was. And one thing Curtis did, the way they had their assembly line and the production facility set up at their factory, I believe it was in New York, they had kind of a semi-modular construction system and a system that really just cranked these out. They were relatively inexpensive. In fact, I think it was the most inexpensive mass production modern fighter in World War II for America. So not only did they turn out enough for the U.S., they turned out enough for Britain and, of course, other allies, like I mentioned, Russia, China, and so on and so forth. The thing is, against older aircraft, the Warhawk was equal or superior. But against newer models of the Bf-109, like the F or the Focke-Wulf 190A, and definitely the Japanese Ki-43 Oscar and A6M0, it was generally outclassed. It had pretty average to even below average climb. Its top speed was at best average for 1941-42. Its armament of 4 30 cal guns and 2 50 cals was maybe slightly above average, but nothing special. Its range was good, but not amazing. It was in all ways a very average aircraft. But the fact that it was able to be adopted and fielded so quickly was really, it gave them something that was marginally better than the P-36, and it gave it to them, if not yesterday, effectively tomorrow. And it did have some benefits. For example, it was very good in a dive. It was also a very good fighter-bomber, close air support ground attack plane. It was also very durable and could take a licking, especially later versions like the P-40C that would introduce self-sealing fuel tanks. And it was easy to maintain thanks to its modular construction out in the field, so it didn't have a lot of problems breaking down. And if it did, you could fix it. And also, and this was important early in the war when there were a lot of raw recruits, it was a pretty forgiving airplane to learn to fly. And at lower altitudes, it was a decent turner and decently maneuverable. So it was unexceptionable, but not bad. And while it had some shortcomings, it had no just horrible detractions. And frankly, up till about 1943, this was the mainstay of the U.S. Army Air Corps, Air Forces, and really helped the British as well as the Russians. So it definitely had a reason. And to be fair, sometimes it's good to go the most modern. And of course, the P-38 would go into service and be a good plane. And of course, newer planes like the P-47 and P-51 would be coming. But nevertheless, the P-40 was there, and between 1940 and 1944, they turned out over 13,700 of these, making it the third most produced U.S. fighter of the war. More than really any of the other Navy ones, and kind of only behind the P-47 and the P-51. So it's interesting that its attributes are maybe not at first apparent. It does seem a bit vanilla. But, it got the job done. And that's why these actually stayed in service all the way through the end of the war, even when newer planes were coming online. To jump around a bit, yeah, the British, the Commonwealth, did receive some of the original 200 or so P-40s that they called the Tomahawk 1. Now, interestingly, the Tomahawk 1 was not really considered combat ready, but needs must. But by 1941, the Tomahawk 2, the P-40B, was coming into service, and the British considered using it in the European theater, but testing just showed that it didn't have the performance at high altitude to go up against the enemy. So instead they were used primarily in North Africa. And it was a good place for them. They had their first confirmed kill in June. And early on they were used for escorts and ground support. And then in 1942, the Kitty Hawk Mark I started replacing the Tomahawk Mark II. Now, the Kitty Hawk is what the British called the P-40D, P-40E, and so on. We'll talk about that. And they also started deploying them more and more as fighter bombers in 1942, 1943. And from there, they would go on. Originally, when they were put in service in 1941, they would replace Hawker Hurricanes, which weren't especially well suited to the desert. The P-40's durability was quite well done. But then they started to be replaced in turn by tropicalized Spitfires. But they still stayed in service regardless, and even the French started to fly them as the Free French Air Force became more of a thing. But they received a large number. 18 some odd squadrons in Britain had them. Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand all used a version of the P-42. And they found them to be at least equal in good hands to the Bf-109E, superior to some early Italian fighters, and early on they did have a pretty good combat record. Well, the honor of the first German plane shot down by an American pilot goes to a P-40C in August of 1942. That was over Iceland. But really, much like the British, Americans found that operating them in the Mediterranean theater, North Africa, Mediterranean, was the place to be for this plane. And so that summer, June, July, they started to station them there. And they were pretty successful. They were used in Operation Torch to support that, actually even flying the lightweight version, the P-40L, flying from the USS Ranger, the aircraft carrier, in early 1943. and they were used to attack German and Italian transports and bombers. One notable incident was on April 18th, known as the Palm Sunday Massacre. A flight of over 100 German transports with escorts was found out thanks to intelligence decoding, and so they were intercepted, and over 58 of the Junkers Ju-52s were shot down, with over 20 more different planes forced to land, so they didn't get shot down. And they would shoot down over a dozen of the escorting planes. And they only lost 5 P-40s and then a couple of other aircraft, so a good exchange for the Allies. The P-40s did have a pretty... They gave, but they also received. They had about a 2-to-1 ratio, maybe 3-to-1 later on. So they were being shot down. They were definitely not a cutting-edge fighter, but thanks to good tactics and whatnot, they were still effective. And again, they at least had them in numbers, and they didn't have a major issue with spare parts. Of course, you can't also talk about this and not mention the 99th, the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American group of pilots to be sent into combat. There had been pilots in the Air Force, Air Corps before, but not sent into combat. And they received brand new P-40s and were sent into combat in the Mediterranean theater in June of 1943. And they had their first confirmed kill on July 2nd. It was actually of a Focke-Wulf FW-190, which is pretty impressive for a Warhawk. And they would continue to fly the plane throughout that year. In 1944, they would be replaced gradually by the P-39 and P-51. But some pilots really did like their Warhawks. Others were happy to give them up. I mean, I don't think they were hated, but they weren't always loved. But they really did prove to be a very good fighter bomber, and they put up with the rigors of the desert, but again, they were never really used in Europe. But they were used in the Pacific quite a bit. In 1941, 1942 in the Pacific, the P-40 was the main U.S. Army Air Corps fighter. And it was considered a good ship, dependable and whatnot. But honestly, it's what they had, and it really helped break the Japanese momentum, the offense, alongside the F-4F Wildcat, which wasn't a perfect plane, in the P-39 Airacobra, which wasn't a perfect plane, but somehow they managed to get the job done. Like I said, this is George Welch's from Pearl Harbor, one of the few planes that got into the air. Many more were destroyed on the ground at Pearl Harbor, and of course more were lost during the invasion of the Philippines. Yet they managed to muster some resistance during the Dutch East Indies and shoot down around 50 Japanese planes. They were also critical in the Solomon Islands campaign and in defense of Australia itself in 1942. And during this more defensive war, the plane's somewhat shorter range wasn't a big deal. And it's kind of interesting that in July of 1942, the Australian Air Force and the U.S. Air Force kind of pooled their resources and shared spare parts, components, even airframes, because they were both flying the P-40. But in late 1942, the P-38 came into use and started to replace these. It had much greater range and high altitude performance, although the P-40 still had better low altitude maneuverability. at least in some instances. And then after that, you'd see newer planes like the P-47 and, of course, the P-51. So really, by 1943, 1944, these aren't being used all that much. But some still stayed in service to the end of the war. They were used for reconnaissance, also forward air control, and of course the plane's probably most popular role as a fighter bomber. So they were around, and they held up pretty well. And it's worth pointing out that while, of course, American aircraft greatly improved during the war, the Japanese aircraft kind of hit a point of stagnation, and more importantly, whereas Allied pilots received better training, developed better tactics, the Japanese lost most of their best pilots in 1942-43, so that by 1944, their pilots kind of had lost the edge. And again, there were still many that liked the P-40. It certainly was not a hated aircraft. Well, with that said, what about the later war versions, and of course its most famous use in China by the so-called Flying Tigers? So the P-40C introduced a drop tank, it introduced bomb racks, it introduced self-sealing fuel tanks. The D, which was only made in small numbers like 50, replaced the two 50 cal fuselage guns and the four 30 cal wing guns with four 50 calibers mounted on the wings. And they also improved the cockpit and canopy layout. The next model, the F, would play around with using, the next model, the E, would be very similar, but put into much wider production, and it would go to 6 50 caliber machine guns. Also, there would be some engine and performance improvements. The L was the lightweight model, where they stripped down everything they could to get increased maneuverability, speed, range, what have you. The K and the M models tried out some new engine types, and then there would be a late war Allison. They would also have tried in a few different models Merlin engine to get better high speed performance, high altitude performance. And then the final model, which this model is here, is the N, which was a lightweight model with the final Allison engine used. It had an improved canopy, especially for rear visibility. Now, initially it had 4 50 cal guns in the wings to save weight. Pilots complained, so they went back to 6. And again, it could still carry up to 2,000 pounds in bombs. It had added armor, and it did have better high altitude performance and better speed. For example, when they went to the P-40C, it was great to have those self-sealing fuel tanks, but that and the other armor lowered the top speed, so they kind of gained that back. And the P-40N and its variants were made in 1943 and 1944 until production was halted. So, in China, the American Volunteer Group, AVG, Flying Tigers, first received the B model in 1941, but they weren't real crazy about it. The ones they received didn't come with radios. They didn't have bomb racks. They didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks. They were much happier with the C models that they got. They had many features. And then they started to receive the E in 1942. And this really helped them out. To put it bluntly, the Warhawk really saved China, Burma, and kept Japan from getting into India. It mostly was down to the skill of its pilots, and to be fair, mechanics, engineers, because In that theater, they suffered from spare part shortages. Heck, sometimes they couldn't even get tires, and sometimes they had to use kind of makeshift racks to use Russian bombs that the Chinese had, because they couldn't get enough American. But yeah, it really, even though they took losses, they dealt it out to the Japanese, who were arguably in superior planes. This helped gain air superiority in the theater by the end of 1942, something that was enjoyed for the rest of the war by them. They also started using later versions like the E as fighter bombers. Kind of funnily enough, they unofficially had a version that they called the B-40 that carried 3 500-pound bombs and would often go at bridges and other installations like railheads, bombing them, and then when repair crews would come out to fix them, they would bomb them too. And so they were used very effectively as fighter bombers. And then in 1942, the American Volunteer Group would be absorbed into the Army Air Forces, becoming the 23rd Fighter Group, but they would continue to operate in theater. And they would start to have their older P-40s replaced by P-51s, and while some pilots were perfectly happy with this, some actually still kind of preferred the P-40, claiming that it was a better plane for the Chinese Burma type theater. So, who might argue? I don't know. Why not? China would get their last notable batch of Warhawks in 1943, also for what that's worth. So they did continue to update and improve the design. For example, to help with the more powerful Allison engine used later on, they did actually stretch the fuselage a bit for a little better stability. And like I said, give a little better rear visibility to the cockpit, and continue to add armor to better protect the pilot, which is really good in a fighter bomber, frankly. And yeah, they would continue to see service in China until the end of the war, even if in decreased numbers. Well, I hope this video starts to make up for me kind of maybe overdoing the Navy and not addressing the Army, Air Force planes. As far as comparing the models, the Corgi and the Hobby Master, they're very similar. Both have gear up or down, spinning propellers. Both come with a good stand. The Hobby Master has an opening canopy with a removable pilot. The Corgi doesn't have an opening canopy, but they do have a pilot, so that's fine. Corgi definitely does more of the early ones. Hobby Master does the ends and such, the later ones. Now they do a B, but it's in their 1/48 scale, not the 1/72, and just not really my thing. I guess before I go, I shouldn't mention the Soviet Union, if nothing else because the Warhawk, which they refer to as the Tomahawk, was the first plane fighter they officially received due to the Lend-Lease program. They got some via the UK. They also got some directly from the USA after they were in the war. And early on, they received the P-40B and P-40C. They kind of received them mostly in kits, and they assembled their first 50 or so in September of 1941. They assembled them, test flew them, and they found some problems, but nevertheless they had them in combat by October, and by January they had shot down some German Bf-109s. They didn't like the Bs and Cs for the reasons you come to expect now. The lighter armament, and they just didn't feel like, this is Russia. To them, the Warhawk wasn't durable enough and was too difficult to maintain. But to be fair, the Russian winter was kicking in hard in 41-42, and that was really wreaking havoc with this plane. Also, the lower quality of the fuel that Russia had at the time really did bad things to the engines. But they did like the range, They did like that it had bulletproof glass. And they did like the radios, especially on later models. And so, most of them would say, and it's not surprising, that Soviet planes are better. Just imagine Chekhov saying that. But, they had some nice things to say. While they only received a little under 250 of the early B's and C's, they would actually receive just shy of 2,200 of the later models, like the E, the K, the M, the N. Of these, they mostly used the E and the M. They did use some N's, but by the time these were coming around, Russia had other planes, including ones of their own design, like the Yak-3 and the Lavochkin 3 and 5, or I guess it would be the LGG. Anyway, 3 and 5 coming online, so they really didn't have the need. But in 1942, even if some Russians wouldn't want to admit it, this was crucial to helping defend against the German onslaught, and particularly useful in the defense and support of the siege of Leningrad. But again, the Russian winter was not good to them, and because they liked using airplanes for ground strafing, they felt the early planes with just 2 or 4 30 cows and 2 50 cows just wasn't enough. Now, funnily enough, some of them, they would actually pull the wing guns off to get additional range and fuel in them, but that's a story for another day. Just interesting. The whole Lend-Lease thing is very interesting. And like I said, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, South Africa, I think over 24 nations used the Warhawk in some capacity. Heck, even Japan, who captured several early on in the Pacific War, flew around a dozen of these, including in active combat in 1943. So there were some Warhawks flown under Japanese colors, although obviously not that many. Again, it's a very average plane, to say the least. Not very great climb, good dive, decently maneuverable at low altitudes, horribly maneuverable at high altitudes. I've heard some people say it was just heavily armed. I don't think even the N model with the 650 cows could be said to be heavily armed, because by the end of the war, 20mm cannons were coming into vogue, and lots of planes had 650 cows. Certainly the early ones were a little lightly armed, but on the other hand, they could carry a respectable bomb load. I mean, 2,000 pounds was very good for a World War II era fighter. And the early Allison engines may be a little underpowered, but reliable. The Merlins had some pros and cons. The later Allisons really did help, at least fractionally. But most importantly, they were able to crank so many out for a relatively low price tag and get them in the field. So it has its place. I know the P-51 pretty much gets all the glory. Even the P-47, I would say, is a little more well known than the P-40. And I almost said this is my favorite fighter of World War II. It's not, but it needed to be mentioned, and I figured, why not start off here? So with that, I think I'll call it a day. If you have any questions or comments, please post them. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon. Next time.